When Sarah, a resolute judge in her profession, entered the courtroom that day, she had no idea that the defendant before her would be David, her long-lost childhood friend. Once, they were children playing under the shade of a magnolia tree, but now, David was facing serious charges. But did what was presented in the trial reflect the truth? Or was this an irreversible mistake? This story is not just a legal battle but a struggle between the past and the present, between justice and emotions. What comes next will undoubtedly make you think. Can you even imagine what might unfold in this trial? The courtroom was tense, filled with the rustling of attorneys shuffling papers, hushed whispers from the audience, and the distant sound of a gavel echoing from another room. Judge Sarah Collins sat at her bench, her gaze steady and professional. Another ordinary day, another case, or so she thought. The clerk called the case, State of Louisiana v. David Johnson. Sarah shifted slightly, her hands resting lightly on the smooth oak desk. She scanned the list of charges in front of her: assault, robbery, resisting arrest. A familiar sense of frustration filled her chest, as if a lost soul had again become entangled in the gears of the justice system. When the defendant was brought into the courtroom, Sarah's world seemed to collapse. The man standing before her, shackled at the wrists and ankles, was not a stranger. It was David Johnson, her childhood friend. Her throat tightened, and a flood of memories came rushing back. Summer afternoons racing bikes down the dusty streets of Hammond, Louisiana, late-night conversations beneath the magnolia tree in her backyard, promises made when they were children to always stand by each other, no matter what. But the man standing before her was not the boy she remembered. His shoulders were hunched, his face bearing the marks of hard years. Yet, his eyes, the deep, soulful eyes, were unmistakable. Her hand clenched around the gavel, and for the first time in her career, Sarah hesitated. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing in as she tried to process the unthinkable. David lifted his head, his expression a mixture of shock and resignation. His eyes briefly met hers before quickly diverting, his head bowing slightly. The courtroom was deathly silent, waiting. Sarah struggled to regain her composure, her voice barely steady as she spoke. "Mr. Johnson, you are charged with assault and robbery. How do you plead?" David's voice was hoarse, almost unrecognizable. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Sarah's heart pounded. She wanted to stop everything, demand answers, to understand what had happened to him, how their paths had diverged so far. But her role as a judge required her to be unwavering. "Proceed," she said, her tone firm, though it didn't reflect the storm raging inside her, as the prosecutor began their opening statement. Sarah's mind was in turmoil. This was no ordinary case. This was David, and somehow, she had to find a way to separate the past from the present before everything spiraled out of control. The room seemed to fade as her thoughts drifted back to a time long before she donned her black robe and wielded the gavel. She and David had grown up on opposite ends of Hammond, Louisiana, not separated by distance, but by the unspoken rules of a divided town. Her house was a modest one-story with a white picket fence, while David's family lived in a rundown house at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by fields. Their friendship was an oddity. She remembered the day they met, a chance encounter by the creek, when she had wandered far from her backyard. David was fishing, his line tangled in the brush, and she helped him untangle it. That simple act sparked years of secret adventures and shared dreams. "Sarah," he once said as they lay on the grass beneath the starry sky, "have you ever thought about leaving this place? Leaving for good, to somewhere where they don't look at us like this, just for sitting together?" She laughed, dismissing the thought, but David wasn't joking. From a young age, he viewed the world differently, a place that didn't always have room for people like him. Their friendship only grew stronger despite the whispers, the side glances, and the disapproval from both sides. But the pressure was always there, like a burden they couldn't shake. Then one day, it all ended. It was the summer before high school when Sarah's father found them sitting on the porch together. His voice was cold and sharp. "Sarah, get inside now." She hesitated, looking at David, who stood motionless. "Go," he said softly, his voice full of resignation. "I'll see you later." But they didn't see each other again, at least not truly. Her father forbade her from being around David, and soon after, his family moved away. Sarah threw herself into her studies, her ambition driving her away from Hammond. But she never forgot the boy who taught her what it meant to be brave. Now, sitting as a judge, Sarah wondered what David had become after she stepped into that house and closed the door on their friendship. His record showed a string of arrests for minor offenses, petty theft, vagrancy, nothing that indicated a violent nature. But how could one truly judge a person by a few lines on a criminal record? The prosecutor's voice snapped her back to the present. He was describing the crime David was accused of: assaulting a store clerk during a robbery at a convenience store in Baton Rouge. The clerk was lightly injured, and the register had been emptied. David had been caught a few blocks away, the alleged cash still in his possession. Sarah watched David as the prosecutor continued. He slouched in his seat, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, but his face was completely unreadable. Did he really do it? Or was there more to the story that the prosecutor hadn't revealed? The trial broke for lunch, giving Sarah a moment to collect her thoughts. When she returned to her office, her assistant, Rachel, approached with a hesitant look on her face. "Judge Collins, are you all right? You seem a little distracted," Rachel asked. Sarah hesitated. Should she confide in Rachel? Was it too unprofessional to admit that she knew the defendant? She shook her head, trying to maintain her composure. "I'm fine, just a lot on my mind." But she wasn't fine. How could she be? With the past she had tried so hard to forget sitting right in front of her, just a few steps away, waiting for her judgment. The courtroom was packed as the trial resumed. Reporters scribbled notes in a frenzy, the clerk shuffled papers, and the prosecutor, a sharp-faced man named Mark Davis, was ready to present the case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Davis began, his voice firm, "this case is about violence. It's the story of a man who walked into a convenience store and, without any clear provocation, assaulted an innocent employee before stealing all the money from the register. The evidence will show that David Johnson is the perpetrator of this crime." A knot tightened in Sarah's stomach. The prosecutor's tone was cold, detached, as if David were nothing more than a name on a file. She glanced at David, who remained focused on the table, his gaze unflinching. The defense attorney, Emily Parker, stood to give her opening statement. She was young but confident, her voice carrying across the room. "The prosecutor wants you to believe this is a simple case, but it's not. My client, David Johnson, has maintained his innocence from the start. We will show you that this story is far more complex than the prosecutor has led you to believe, and the assumptions made that night won't stand up under scrutiny." The first witness called to the stand was a store clerk who had worked the night of the incident. He described seeing a man matching David's description enter the store, argue with the cashier, and then rush past the counter. His testimony was detailed, but something about it made Sarah feel as though it had been rehearsed. Emily began her cross-examination with sharp precision. "Mr. Brooks, you said the man who attacked the store employee was wearing a red hoodie, correct?" "Yes," the witness replied. "Did you get a clear look at his face?" "Not really, it was too dark, and he had his hood up." Emily nodded, walking lightly around the witness stand. "So, you can't say for certain that the person who committed the assault was him?" "No, but—" "No further questions," Emily interrupted. Sarah noticed David shift slightly, his posture straightening as if the exchange had given him a flicker of hope. The next piece of evidence was a security video from the store. The footage was grainy and poorly lit, showing a figure in a red hoodie entering the store. The prosecutor argued that the person in the video was David, but the quality of the video made identification unclear. As the video played, Sarah stared intently at the screen. Could this really be David? The image in the video moved quickly, a hand hurriedly grabbing the counter before disappearing from view. The video ended abruptly, leaving an unsettling gap in the narrative. David's defense hinged on a statement that he had been walking home from a friend's house at the time of the robbery. However, the friend was unwilling to testify out of fear of retaliation from the community. Emily argued that the lack of a witness shouldn't diminish David's innocence, but the expressions on the jurors' faces showed clear skepticism. As the trial continued, Sarah felt the weight of her responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. She was expected to be fair, to stand as a pillar of justice, but how could she be fair when every moment reminded her of their shared childhood? The boy who had once been her closest friend was now a man fighting for his freedom, and she was the one tasked with deciding his fate. During the break, Sarah remained seated behind the bench, her fingers lightly tracing the surface of the gavel. She wanted to speak with David, ask him directly what had happened, but she knew she couldn't. Any contact outside the courtroom would jeopardize the case and her career. Watching David being led out of the room, the chains around his wrists and ankles made Sarah's head spin. She had always believed in the justice system, in its ability to uncover the truth, but for the first time, she wondered if truth was something the system could truly grasp. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the trial reached a critical turning point. It was now the defense's turn to present their case, and Emily Parker called her first key witness, Officer Jake Turner, the officer who had arrested David. Sarah leaned forward, her gaze sharp. This could be the moment when any cracks in the case began to show. Officer Turner, a broad-shouldered man with a hardened look, stepped onto the witness stand. Emily approached, her voice calm. Officer Turner, you're the one who arrested my client, correct? Yes, he replied curtly. You wrote in your report that Mr. Johnson was walking 2 blocks from the scene of the robbery when you arrested him. Is that correct? Yes. What led you to believe he was the suspect? Turner shifted in his seat. He matched the description. An African-American male, around 38 years old, wearing dark clothing. Emily raised an eyebrow, her eyes sharp as knives. Dark clothing, but the suspect in the video was wearing a red hoodie. Did you find a red hoodie on Mr. Johnson when you searched him? Turner hesitated. No, but he might have discarded it. Emily moved closer, her voice cutting through the air. Might have? Did you or any other officers search the area for that red hoodie? Turner clenched his jaw. No, we didn't have time. He was arrested very quickly. Emily continued, her tone ice cold. So, to clarify, you arrested my client based on a vague description with no physical evidence linking him to the scene? The officer fell silent, and his silence spoke louder than any words could. Sarah glanced at the jury. A few members exchanged skeptical looks. Emily wasn't finished. Officer Turner, do you remember what Mr. Johnson said when he was arrested? He denied it, saying he was innocent. Did you consider investigating his claim, or did you just assume his guilt based on his appearance? Turner's face flushed. I was following process. Process? Emily echoed, her voice laced with doubt. No further questions, Your Honor. The courtroom buzzed again as Turner stepped down, the confidence in his testimony visibly shaken. Sarah's heart raced. This was no longer just a trial. It had become a confrontation, not only with David, but with a system that seemed all too eager to condemn him. The next move from the defense caught everyone off guard. Emily introduced an expert witness, a forensic analyst who had reviewed the surveillance footage. The analyst explained that based on the height and build of the person in the video, there was no way to definitively identify him as David. Furthermore, the timestamp on the video had been altered, casting doubt on its reliability. The prosecutor attempted to dismiss this, claiming the witness's testimony was based on conjecture, but the jury began to show signs of confusion. A shadow of doubt drifted through the room, and Sarah could feel its weight as the day of the trial neared its end. David was permitted to take the stand. Emily had warned him about the risks, but David was resolute. The chains rattled as he moved toward the witness stand. His voice, though quiet, carried a clear sincerity. I made mistakes in my life, David began, his gaze directed toward the jury. I went down the wrong path, trusted the wrong people, but I didn't do this. That night, I was just walking home, minding my own business, when the police stopped me. They didn't ask any questions, they just decided I was a suspect. His voice faltered slightly as he continued. I've had to fight my whole life, fight for people to see me as more than what they assume I am. But I'm tired. I just want the truth to be heard. Sarah's throat tightened as David sat back down. His words hung in the air, a plea not only for justice, but for humanity. She glanced at the jury, their faces a mix of emotions, doubt, empathy, uncertainty. This was the pivotal moment. The truth was no longer just about evidence or testimony. It was a battle within their consciences, a struggle against the weight of prejudice and assumption. Sarah knew her role wasn't just to uphold the law, but to interpret it in a way that would deliver true justice. The final day of the trial arrived with a heavy, expectant atmosphere. Closing arguments were presented with precision. The prosecutor emphasized circumstantial evidence, urging the jury to trust the integrity of the system. Meanwhile, Emily pleaded with them to look beyond appearances, to consider the gaps in the case and the humanity of the defendant. Sarah listened intently, her expression calm, but her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Her task was clear. She couldn't make the decision for the jury, but she would have the power to decide if there was room for interpretation in their verdict. The weight of ensuring true justice pressed heavily on her. The jury deliberated. For hours. The courtroom was quiet, then filled with movement as people stood to stretch or whispered among themselves. David sat still, his hands clenched tightly in front of him. He hadn't looked at Sarah since the first day of the trial, and she couldn't blame him. What could she say to make things right? Finally, the clerk announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom fell silent, and 4 people stood, one hand trembling with the paper they held. In the case of the state of Louisiana versus David Johnson, we find the defendant. The pause stretched on, feeling eternal. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted in sighs, murmurs, and even a few claps. Sarah struck the gavel, restoring order. David's shoulders slumped as if a heavy burden had been lifted, but his face remained unreadable. He had won his freedom, but it was clear that this victory had come at a price. Sarah stood, her voice steady. The jury has rendered its verdict. Mr. Johnson, you are free. The court is adjourned. As the courtroom emptied, Sarah remained standing, watching David as he signed the release papers. She thought he might leave without saying a word. But then he turned, walking toward her. The courtroom was nearly empty, with only a few clerks cleaning up and Rachel gathering the case files. David stopped just a few steps from her desk, his expression guarded. You don't owe me anything, he said quietly, but I want to know, why didn't you say anything? You know me. Sarah felt her throat tighten, the words catching in her mouth. Because I couldn't. I had to be fair. If I said anything, it could have ruined the case. David looked at her, his face a mix of pain and understanding. Fair, he repeated. That's the problem, Sarah. The world has never been fair. Not for people like me. She nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the smooth wooden surface of the judge's desk. You're right. I wish I had done more back then. I wish I could do more now. David exhaled, his body relaxing a little, as if the weight had lessened, if only slightly. We were just kids, not knowing anything. But now you get it, don't you? David's voice had dropped. I understand, Sarah replied, her voice firm. And I'm sorry. David gave a slight nod before turning and walking away, his posture straight, his eyes never looking back as he disappeared through the courthouse doors. Sarah sat alone in the empty courtroom, his words weighing heavily on her shoulders. She had upheld the law, but the trial had revealed a deeper truth. Justice wasn't just about verdicts or evidence. It was about the lives impacted by systems far bigger than any one person. For Sarah, this was an awakening, a reminder that her position was not just a seat of power, but a foundation for change. As she left the courthouse in the evening, the setting sun casting long shadows on the steps, Sarah made a silent vow to herself. She couldn't change the past, but she would do everything in her power to ensure that the future wasn't just full of meaningless promises of justice. It would be hard, maybe impossible, but she owed it to David and to herself to try. We were just kids, not knowing anything. But now you get it, don't you? David's voice had dropped. I understand, Sarah replied, her voice firm. And I'm sorry. David gave a slight nod before turning and walking away, his posture straight, his eyes never looking back as he disappeared through the courthouse doors. Sarah sat alone in the empty courtroom, the weight of his words pressing heavily on her shoulders. She had upheld the law, but the trial had revealed a deeper truth. Justice was not just about verdicts or evidence. but about the lives shaped by systems far greater than any one individual. For Sarah, this was an awakening, a reminder that her position wasn't merely one of power, but of responsibility, a platform for change. As she left the courtroom in the fading light of the evening, the setting sun stretching long shadows across the courthouse steps, Sarah made a silent vow. She couldn't change the past, but she would do everything in her power to ensure that the future wasn't just filled with hollow promises of justice. It would be difficult, perhaps impossible, but she owed it to David and to herself to try. This story is not just a battle in the courtroom, but a lesson in justice, friendship, and the choices we make in life. If you were Sarah, what decision would you make when faced with this complex past and present? Could you maintain fairness, or would you be swayed by personal emotions? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice could help others reflect and view the issue from a different perspective. If this story resonates with you, don't hesitate to share it with your friends and loved ones to help spread the message of justice and forgiveness. Thank you so much for your continued support of the channel. We truly appreciate each and every one of you. During the content creation process, there may have been some small mistakes, and we hope you'll kindly overlook them. Wishing everyone happiness, peace, and good health in life. Stay tuned for more.